You don't belong here, the manager said, his voice cutting through the steady hum of rolling suitcases and distant boarding calls, and for a split second, the entire terminal seemed to hold its breath as if the air itself was waiting to see what would happen next. The fluorescent lights above Gate C12 flickered softly against polished floors, reflecting a man most people had already decided not to see. A tall black man in worn shoes and a weathered coat standing quietly beside a row of empty seats, his posture calm, his eyes steady, as though the chaos of the airport moved around him but never touched him, while a few travelers slowed their pace just enough to glance, not out of concern but curiosity, the kind that fades quickly when it finds no entertainment. Ryan Caldwell stood a few feet away, crisp uniform pressed sharp, badge catching the light with every subtle shift of his shoulders. The authority in his stance unmistakable, the kind built not just from policy but from years of being obeyed without question, and in his world, people like the man in front of him were problems to be managed, disruptions to be cleared, variables that didn't belong in a system designed for order. The overhead speaker crackled, announcing a delayed departure to Chicago, but the words blurred into the background as the tension between the two men thickened, something invisible yet heavy settling into the space between them. And still, the man, Elijah Brooks, did not move, did not argue, did not raise his voice. He simply stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, as if he had already seen this moment play out before, as if he knew something no one else in that terminal did. A woman in business attire paused near a charging station, her phone halfway to her ear, eyes flicking between the two men, while a teenage boy leaned subtly to get a better angle for a video he hadn't yet decided to start recording. And somewhere in the distance, a child laughed, the sound strangely out of place against the quiet tension gathering like a storm that hadn't yet decided to break. Ryan took a step closer, his shoes tapping sharply against the tile, each step deliberate, controlled, a silent assertion of power, and when he spoke again, his tone dropped lower, colder, the kind of voice that didn't need to shout to be heard. "I'm asking you one last time," he said, each word measured, precise. "Move along." And still, Elijah didn't flinch, didn't look away, his gaze steady but not defiant, calm but not submissive, just present, fully present in a moment where everyone else seemed to be playing roles they didn't even realize they'd been assigned. A gust of air from the automatic doors, carried in the faint scent of jet fuel and rain from the runway outside, brushing past Elijah's coat as if trying to pull him toward the exit, toward invisibility, toward the expectation everyone else had already accepted for him, but he remained, grounded, unmoved, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost gentle, yet it carried further than anyone expected, slipping through the noise, cutting clean through the assumptions hanging in the air. "You're making a mistake," he said. Not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact, the kind that doesn't need to be defended because it already knows it's true, and something in the way he said it, calm, certain, unshaken, caused a brief flicker of hesitation in Ryan's expression, a crack so small it might have gone unnoticed if the moment hadn't been so still, so charged, so precise, like the pause before a decision you can't take back. The lights hummed softly overhead, the terminal stretched endlessly in both directions, and for just a second, everything seemed suspended, every footstep slowed, every voice dimmed, every breath measured, as if the entire airport had quietly stepped back to watch a moment it didn't yet understand, and in that suspended silence, Elijah stood exactly where he was, not asking for space, not demanding respect, simply existing in a place that had already decided he shouldn't. While somewhere deep beneath the surface of it all, unseen and unnoticed, something irreversible had already begun to shift. Ryan Caldwell let out a slow breath through his nose, the kind that carried more irritation than patience, and for a moment he said nothing, just studied the man in front of him as if trying to figure out what category to place him in, because in Ryan's world everything had a category, everything had a label that made it easier to manage, easier to control, but Elijah Brooks did not fit cleanly into any of them, not with the way he stood there, not with the way he spoke, not with the way he seemed entirely unaffected by the pressure building around him. Somewhere behind them, a rolling suitcase rattled loudly over a cracked tile, the sharp sound snapping a few people back into motion, but their eyes kept drifting back, drawn by something they could not quite name, something that felt less like a confrontation and more like the beginning of a story they did not want to miss. Ryan shifted his weight, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve with a quick, practiced motion, a small gesture that restored his sense of control, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the authority of someone who had never needed to repeat himself twice. "This is a secured area," he said, each word deliberate. "You cannot just stand here without a valid reason." And he gestured vaguely toward the seating area, toward the polished floors, toward the invisible line he believed Elijah had crossed simply by existing in the wrong place. Elijah's gaze followed the motion briefly, then returned, calm and steady, and there was something almost disarming about the way he listened, as if he were giving Ryan his full attention not out of obligation, but out of choice, and that subtle difference made Ryan's jaw tighten just slightly, a reaction so small it might have gone unnoticed if not for the stillness surrounding them. A nearby airport employee slowed her cart, pretending to check her phone while clearly listening, while a middle-aged man in a navy suit leaned against a pillar, arms crossed, watching with the quiet interest of someone who had seen power play out in many forms but sensed this one might end differently. Elijah finally spoke again, his voice low. "I am waiting," he said, simple, unembellished, as if the explanation required nothing more, and yet the way he said it carried a weight that did not match his appearance, a quiet certainty that made the words feel heavier than they should have been. Ryan frowned, a small crease forming between his brows. "Waiting for what?" he asked, though his tone suggested he did not expect an answer worth hearing, and for the first time, Elijah's eyes shifted slightly, not away, but past Ryan, toward the wide glass windows overlooking the runway where a plane was slowly taxiing into position, its lights cutting through the gray afternoon haze. "For something that belongs to me," Elijah said, and the sentence hung there, suspended, vague enough to dismiss yet precise enough to linger, and a few people nearby exchanged glances, subtle, almost involuntary, as if they had all heard the same thing but were unsure what to make of it. Ryan let out a short, humorless breath, the kind that signaled disbelief more than amusement, and he shook his head once. "That is not how this works," he replied, his voice tightening just a fraction. "You cannot just stand in a restricted terminal and claim ownership of anything." And as he spoke, he took another step forward, closing the distance slightly, reinforcing the unspoken boundary he believed he controlled. Elijah did not step back, did not mirror the movement, he simply remained where he was, grounded, his presence steady in a way that felt increasingly out of place in a setting built on constant motion, and for a brief second, Ryan hesitated again, not outwardly. Not enough for anyone to call it hesitation, but internally, a flicker of something unfamiliar crossed his mind, something that did not align with the narrative he had already decided on. The overhead lights hummed softly, the distant roar of a departing aircraft rolled through the glass, and in that layered soundscape, the space between them seemed to narrow, not physically, but emotionally, as if the moment itself were drawing tighter, preparing for something inevitable. Elijah's hands remained relaxed at his sides, his shoulders loose, his breathing even, and there was no trace of urgency in him, no attempt to justify himself further, no need to prove anything, and that absence of defensiveness created a quiet tension that pressed against the edges of the scene, because in a place where everyone was rushing, explaining, proving, moving, he was doing none of those things, and it made him stand out more than anything else ever could. Ryan glanced briefly toward the security desk, then back at Elijah, the decision already forming in his mind, the next step clear, procedural, expected, and yet as he opened his mouth to call it in, that earlier sentence echoed again, faint but persistent. "You are making a mistake." And for reasons he could not fully explain, it did not feel like a challenge, it felt like a certainty, and that difference, subtle as it was, began to settle somewhere deeper than he was comfortable admitting. Ryan Caldwell's fingers tightened slightly around the radio clip to his belt, the plastic edge pressing into his palm as if grounding him back into the version of reality he understood, one where protocol was clear and authority was never questioned, and without breaking eye contact, he lifted the device closer to his mouth, his voice measured, controlled, but carrying a sharper edge now. "Security to gate C12," he said, each word crisp, official. "I need assistance with an unauthorized individual refusing to comply." And the words seemed to ripple outward, not just through the radio but through the small crowd that had quietly gathered, their attention sharpening, their curiosity deepening, as if something unspoken had just crossed a line that could not be undone. Elijah Brooks did not react to the call, did not glance at the radio or the approaching consequences. He simply stood there, his posture unchanged, his breathing steady, as though the escalation unfolding around him existed on a different layer than the one he occupied, and that stillness, that refusal to be pulled into the rising tension, made the moment feel increasingly unbalanced, like a scale that had already tipped but had not yet revealed in which direction. A pair of uniformed security officers appeared at the far end of the terminal, their figures cutting through the flow of passengers, their pace purposeful but not rushed. And as they moved closer, a subtle shift passed through the crowd, people adjusting their positions, creating space, some stepping back, others leaning in, drawn by the quiet gravity of the situation, phones now more visibly raised, small glowing screens capturing fragments of a story that none of them fully understood. Ryan lowered the radio slowly, his shoulders squaring as if the arrival of security reinforced his position, his control, and he gestured toward Elijah with an open hand, the motion firm, definitive. "This is your last chance," he said, his tone no longer masking the impatience beneath it. "You need to leave this area now." And for a brief second, the words hung in the air, waiting for resistance, waiting for argument, waiting for the kind of reaction that would justify everything that came next. But Elijah did not argue, did not raise his voice. He simply looked at Ryan, and there was something different in his expression now, not anger, not fear, but a quiet clarity. As if the moment had finally aligned with something he had been expecting all along, and when he spoke, his voice remained calm, almost gentle. "You are still in time to stop," he said, and the sentence, simple as it was, landed with a weight that did not match its volume, causing one of the nearby onlookers to shift uncomfortably, as if the words had reached further than intended. The security officers slowed as they approached, exchanging a quick glance between themselves, their eyes flicking from Ryan to Elijah and back again, assessing, measuring, reading a situation that did not fit the usual pattern of disruption they were trained to handle, and one of them cleared his throat slightly before speaking. "Sir," he addressed Ryan, his tone professional, neutral. "What seems to be the issue?" And Ryan turned toward them with a controlled exhale, the kind that signaled he was ready to hand off the situation to the next level of authority, to reinforce the order he believed was already established. "He is trespassing in a restricted zone and refusing to leave," Ryan said, his words precise, rehearsed in their structure even if spontaneous in delivery, and he took a small step aside, as if making room for the process to unfold exactly as it always did, predictable, structured, contained. The officer nodded once, then turned his attention to Elijah, his gaze steady but not hostile. "Sir," he said, "I am going to need you to come with us so we can sort this out." And for a moment, the entire scene seemed to pause again, the noise of the airport dimming just enough for the weight of that request to settle, because this was the point where most stories followed a familiar path, where resistance met enforcement, where tension broke into action. But Elijah did not move, not immediately. He simply looked at the officer, then back at Ryan, and in that brief exchange of glances, something subtle shifted once more, something almost imperceptible, like a curtain beginning to lift just enough to reveal that the stage was not what it seemed. "I understand your position," Elijah said quietly, his voice steady, respectful, but carrying that same unshakable certainty. "But before you proceed, you should verify who you are being asked to remove." And the sentence, calm and measured, seemed to ripple outward again, catching the officer's attention just long enough to create a flicker of hesitation, a pause that did not belong in a process built on immediate compliance, and Ryan felt it, that pause, that crack in the sequence, and for the first time since this began, something unfamiliar stirred beneath his certainty, not doubt, not yet, but something close enough that it tightened slightly in his chest. Because despite everything aligning in his favor, despite the presence of security, despite the structure of authority standing behind him, there was a growing sense, quiet but persistent, that the moment was no longer moving in the direction he expected, and somewhere beneath the surface of it all, unseen and unspoken, the balance of power had already begun to shift. The officer's hand hovered briefly near his belt, not in threat but in routine, a habitual gesture that usually marked the moment when a situation shifted from conversation to compliance, yet something in Elijah's tone held him there, suspended between action and hesitation, and he glanced again at Ryan Caldwell, expecting reinforcement, expecting confirmation, but what he found instead was a flicker of impatience mixed with something less certain, something Ryan himself had not yet fully recognized. "There is nothing to verify," Ryan said quickly, stepping back into the center of the exchange, his voice tightening as if to close the space Elijah's words had opened. "He is trespassing, and he has been asked to leave." And his emphasis on each word felt deliberate, almost forceful, as though repetition alone could restore the order he believed was slipping. The officer nodded once, acknowledging the statement, but his eyes did not leave Elijah, because there was something about the man's composure that did not align with the scenario being described, something that made the usual script feel incomplete, and in that brief pause, the second officer shifted his stance slightly, scanning the area, noting the gathering crowd, the raised phones, the subtle tension that had settled into the air like a low hum beneath the surface noise of the terminal. Elijah's gaze moved between them, calm, steady, never hurried, and when he spoke again, it was not louder, not sharper, but clearer, each word landing with quiet precision. "I am not refusing to comply," he said. "I am asking you to confirm before you act." And the distinction, simple as it sounded, carried a weight that caused the first officer to tilt his head slightly, reconsidering the sequence unfolding in front of him. A distant boarding announcement echoed overhead, its cheerful tone oddly disconnected from the stillness surrounding gate C12, and somewhere behind the crowd, a suitcase tipped over with a soft thud, quickly righted by its owner. But the attention here did not break, it only tightened, drawn further into the moment that refused to resolve itself the way it should have. Ryan exhaled sharply, a controlled release that failed to hide the growing strain beneath it, and he took another step forward, closing the gap just enough to reassert his presence. "You are delaying a lawful directive," he said, his voice firm, carrying the authority of policy even as it brushed against something less stable. "And that is not acceptable." And for a fraction of a second, his eyes searched Elijah's face, as if looking for the reaction that would validate his position, the resistance that would justify the escalation, but again, it did not come. Instead, Elijah simply nodded once, slowly, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to its premise, and that quiet acknowledgement, that refusal to engage on the expected terms, seemed to unsettle the rhythm of the exchange even further. Because it removed the friction Ryan was prepared to handle and replaced it with something far more difficult to control, a calm that did not push back but did not yield either. The first officer shifted his weight, the subtle movement betraying a reconsideration, and he reached toward the small tablet clipped at his side, his thumb hovering over the screen as if weighing a decision that should have been automatic but now required thought, and in that moment, Ryan noticed it, the hesitation, the break in procedure, and it sent a sharp, quiet jolt through his chest. Because the structure he relied on was beginning to bend, in ways he did not expect. "Officer," Ryan said, his tone sharpening, not quite a command but close enough to carry urgency. "There is no need to complicate this." And yet even as he spoke, the words felt thinner than before, less grounded, as if the certainty behind them had begun to erode. Elijah's eyes followed the officer's hand to the tablet, then returned to Ryan, and for the first time, there was a subtle shift in his expression, not triumph, not satisfaction, but something quieter. Something like patience reaching its end. "It only becomes complicated when assumptions replace facts," he said, and the sentence settled into the space between them, heavier than anything that had been said so far, because it did not challenge authority directly, it challenged the foundation beneath it. The officer glanced down at his screen, then back up, his brow tightening slightly as if something he expected to be simple was not aligning as it should, and the second officer leaned in just Enough to see, their attention narrowing, their focus shifting away from Elijah as a subject and toward the process itself, and that shift, subtle but unmistakable, did not go unnoticed by the crowd. A quiet ripple of anticipation moving through the onlookers as if they too sensed that the moment was no longer about removal but revelation. Ryan felt it then, not fully, not clearly, but enough to register as discomfort, a quiet pressure building beneath his composed exterior, because for the first time since this began, the outcome was no longer predictable, no longer contained within the boundaries he understood. And as the officer's finger finally moved across the screen, initiating a verification that should have been unnecessary, the air around them seemed to tighten once more, not with confrontation, but with the quiet, undeniable sense that whatever came next would not be easily undone. The officer's thumb slid across the tablet screen, the faint glow reflecting in his eyes as lines of data began to populate, each second stretching longer than it should have, each moment adding weight to a silence that no one dared to break, and Ryan Caldwell felt it, the shift, subtle at first, like a pressure building behind a closed door, something he could not see but could no longer ignore. He crossed his arms. A reflex more than a decision, tightening his posture as if physical control could compensate for the uncertainty beginning to seep into the situation, and he glanced briefly at the small crowd that had formed, noticing the phones now fully raised, lenses pointed, capturing everything, and the realization flickered through him that this was no longer a private correction of a minor issue, it had become something else, something visible, something that could not be easily contained or rewritten once it was over. Elijah Brooks stood exactly where he had been, unmoved, his presence steady in contrast to the growing tension around him, and there was no trace of urgency in his face, no flicker of concern, only that same quiet awareness, as if he had already stepped beyond this moment, and was simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. The second officer leaned slightly closer to the first, his voice low, almost lost beneath the distant rumble of a departing aircraft. "What are you seeing?" he asked, and the first officer did not answer immediately, his eyes scanning, reading, verifying, then pausing, returning to the same line as if to confirm it had not changed. Ryan noticed the pause, the repetition, and something tightened in his chest again, sharper this time, more defined, because hesitation in this process was not normal, not expected, and it did not align with the outcome he had already decided was inevitable. "Officer," Ryan said, his tone controlled but edged with impatience, "this does not require extended review." And yet, even as the words left his mouth, they felt thinner, less certain, like a script that had lost its authority the moment it was questioned. The officer finally looked up, his gaze shifting from the screen to Elijah, then briefly to Ryan, and there was something different in his expression now, not alarm, not accusation, but a quiet recalibration, as if the situation had just been redefined in a way that required a different approach. "Sir," he said, addressing Elijah first, his voice measured, respectful, "can you confirm your full name?" And the request landed differently than the previous ones, not as a directive, but as a step toward understanding, and Elijah nodded once, the movement slow, deliberate. "Elijah Brooks," he replied, his voice steady, clear, and as the name settled into the air, the officer's eyes flickered back to the screen, aligning what he saw with what he had just heard, and the connection, once made, seemed to shift something internally, something subtle but undeniable. Ryan let out a short breath, almost a scoff, shaking his head slightly as if dismissing the exchange. "That does not change anything," he said, though the firmness in his tone no longer carried the same weight, and he gestured lightly toward the exit corridor. "He still needs to be removed." But the words did not land the way they had before, they seemed to drift, unsupported, as if the structure behind them had begun to dissolve. The second officer straightened, his posture adjusting in response to whatever he now understood, and he glanced toward the entrance of the terminal, then back at his partner, a silent exchange passing between them, quick but meaningful, and in that brief moment, the balance shifted again, more noticeably this time, like a scale finally revealing its true weight. The first officer took a small step back, not away, but to create space, his hand lowering from the tablet as if the information it contained had already done its work, and he looked at Ryan, his expression composed but no longer aligned with the assumption that had driven the situation forward. "Sir," he said carefully, choosing his words with precision, "I am going to need you to pause for a moment." And the sentence, simple as it was, landed with a quiet finality that cut through the tension more effectively than any raised voice could have. Ryan blinked, the words not immediately processing the way he expected, because they did not fit the sequence, they did not follow the pattern he understood, and for a brief second, the world around him seemed to shift out of alignment, the sounds of the terminal returning in fragments. The distant announcements, the rolling luggage, the low murmur of voices, all blending into a background that no longer felt stable. Elijah remained still, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, and in that stillness, there was no triumph, no satisfaction, only a quiet inevitability, as if the moment had simply reached the point it was always meant to reach, and as Ryan looked between the officer and the man he had already judged, something unfamiliar settled in. Not yet realization, not fully, but close enough to unsettle the certainty he had carried just moments before, because for the first time, the outcome was no longer his to control, and whatever came next would not be shaped by assumption, but by truth. The words lingered in the air longer than they should have. "I am going to need you to pause for a moment." And in that pause, something invisible but undeniable settled over the terminal, not loud, not dramatic, but heavy in a way that made every small sound feel sharper, more defined, the distant rolling of luggage echoing slightly, the soft hum of overhead lights becoming almost noticeable, and Ryan Caldwell stood there, still, his posture intact but no longer as certain as it had been. Because for the first time since this began, the situation had stepped outside the boundaries he understood. He opened his mouth as if to respond, but no words came immediately, only a brief, controlled inhale, and his eyes shifted from the officer to Elijah Brooks, then back again, searching for something to anchor himself to, something familiar, but the rhythm was gone, replaced by a stillness that did not follow his lead. Elijah remained where he was, shoulders relaxed, gaze steady, his presence unchanged, and yet everything around him had shifted, as if the environment itself had begun to realign in quiet recognition of something that had always been there but had not been acknowledged. The first officer lowered the tablet slowly, his grip loosening slightly, not out of uncertainty but resolution, and he glanced once more at the screen before turning it inward, as though what it displayed no longer needed to be shared openly, and that small, deliberate action did not go unnoticed, especially not by Ryan, who felt a subtle tightening in his chest, sharper now, more defined, because whatever the officer had seen, it had changed the direction of this moment in a way that could not be reversed. The second officer stepped half a pace back, creating space not around Elijah, but around Ryan, and it was a quiet shift, almost imperceptible, but meaningful, a repositioning that spoke without words, that redefined the center of the situation without announcement, and a few people in the crowd exchanged glances, sensing the change before fully understanding it. A boarding announcement echoed overhead, clear and cheerful, calling passengers for a flight to Denver, and the normalcy of it contrasted sharply with the suspended moment at gate C12, where time seemed to stretch, not forward, but outward, giving every detail more weight, more presence. Ryan finally spoke, his voice lower now, less controlled than before. "What exactly is the issue?" he asked, though the question felt different than the ones he had asked earlier, less about asserting authority and more about trying to regain clarity. And that shift, subtle but real, did not go unnoticed. The first officer met his gaze, his expression composed, professional, but no longer aligned with the assumptions that had initiated the call, and for a brief second, he did not answer, allowing the silence to settle fully, allowing the weight of the moment to be felt rather than rushed through, and in that silence, Ryan became aware of things he had not noticed before: the number of people watching, the stillness in their posture, the absence of movement that usually defined the terminal. And most of all, the calm in Elijah's presence, a calm that now felt less like passivity and more like certainty. Elijah shifted his weight slightly, not stepping away, not stepping forward, just adjusting, and the movement was small, almost unnoticeable, but it carried a quiet finality, as if the moment had reached a point where nothing more needed to be done on his part, where the outcome no longer depended on his actions. The officer finally spoke, his voice even, measured. "There are details here that need to be handled carefully," he said, choosing each word with precision, and though he did not elaborate, the implication was clear enough to ripple through the space, because it suggested that the situation was not what it had appeared to be, that there was context, authority, ownership perhaps, that had not been recognized. Ryan's jaw tightened slightly, the reaction subtle but present, and he glanced once more at Elijah, really looking this time, not at the clothes, not at the surface, but at the man himself, and for a brief second, something shifted in his perception, something small but irreversible, like a crack forming in a piece of glass that had always seemed solid. The lights above cast a pale reflection across the polished floor, stretching the silhouettes of everyone standing there, elongating the moment visually as much as it felt internally. And in that stretched reflection, Elijah's figure remained steady, grounded, while Ryan's seemed just slightly off balance. Not physically, but in the way the moment held him. No one spoke for a few seconds, not the officers, not the crowd, not even Ryan, and in that silence, the entire terminal seemed to lean into what was coming next, not with anticipation, but with a quiet understanding that something important had already shifted, that the truth, whatever it was, had begun to surface, and that once it fully emerged, nothing about this moment would be seen the same way again. The silence held for just a fraction too long, stretching thin like glass under pressure, and then the first officer finally shifted his stance, not toward Elijah, but toward Ryan Caldwell, and that single movement, subtle yet unmistakable, redrew the entire scene in a way no one could ignore. "Mr. Caldwell," the officer said, his tone still professional, still measured, but now carrying a different weight, one that no longer followed Ryan's lead. "I need you to step aside with us." And the words landed with a quiet finality that cut through the tension more sharply than any raised voice could have, causing a ripple of movement through the crowd as people adjusted, leaning in just enough to confirm what they thought they had heard. Ryan blinked, the request not aligning with the outcome he had been expecting, his mind searching for a moment to correct it, to redirect it, but the rhythm had already shifted beyond his control. "I am the one who called this in," he replied, his voice steady but edged with something new, something less certain. "There seems to be a misunderstanding." And he gestured lightly toward Elijah, as if reasserting the original premise could restore the structure of the situation. The second officer stepped forward just slightly, not aggressive, not confrontational, but firm in a way that left little room for reinterpretation, and he spoke quietly. "Sir, we understand that, but we need to clarify a few things with you." And the emphasis, though subtle, carried enough weight to settle deeper into the moment, reinforcing the shift that had already begun. Elijah Brooks did not move, did not speak, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, and in that stillness, there was no reaction, no visible acknowledgement of what was unfolding, only that same quiet presence that now felt less like patience and more like inevitability. The first officer glanced briefly at his tablet again, then back at Ryan, as if confirming once more what could no longer be denied, and he added carefully, "There are protections and ownership records tied to this name that require us to handle this correctly." And the phrasing, formal and precise, carried implications that moved through the crowd like a quiet current, subtle but unmistakable. Ryan's expression shifted, just slightly, the controlled composure cracking at the edges as the words settled in, and for a brief second, he looked at Elijah again, really looked this time, not at the worn coat or the scuffed shoes, but at the man himself, searching for something that had been invisible to him moments before, something that now refused to be ignored. "Ownership," Ryan repeated under his breath, the word sounding unfamiliar in this context, out of place, and yet it lingered, refusing to dissolve, and the officer nodded once, not elaborating further, allowing the implication to expand on its own. A soft murmur passed through the nearby onlookers, not loud enough to disrupt the scene, but enough to signal a collective realization beginning to form, phone steady, eyes fixed, the story unfolding in real time, shifting from assumption to revelation. Elijah's eyes met Ryan's for a brief moment, and there was no triumph there, no accusation, only a calm recognition, as if the moment had finally arrived where it needed to, and Ryan felt it, that look, that absence of hostility. And it unsettled him more than anger ever could have, because it offered no resistance, no opposition to push against, only a quiet mirror reflecting what had already happened. The officer's voice returned, steady, guiding the moment forward. "Sir, I am going to ask you again to come with us so we can proceed properly." And this time, there was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation, the direction clear, the authority no longer aligned with Ryan's expectation but grounded in something larger, something documented, verified, undeniable. Ryan hesitated, just for a second, the kind of hesitation that reveals itself not in movement but in the absence of it, a pause where certainty used to be, and in that pause, the weight of the situation settled fully, the realization not yet complete but close enough to cast a shadow over everything he had assumed. Behind them, the terminal resumed its rhythm in fragments, a suitcase rolling past, a distant announcement echoing, footsteps returning to motion, but here, at the center of it all, the moment held its shape, defined now not by confrontation but by truth beginning to surface. And as Ryan finally shifted his stance, no longer directing the scene but responding to it, the balance of power completed its turn, quiet, precise, and irreversible. Ryan Caldwell felt the shift before he fully understood it, a quiet unraveling beneath the surface of everything he had assumed, and as he took a small step back, not out of instruction but instinct, the space around him seemed to widen in a way that no longer felt like control but exposure. The officer's presence beside him was steady, not forceful, yet firm in a way that left no room for negotiation. And the second officer positioned himself just slightly behind, creating a subtle boundary that redirected the flow of attention entirely, no longer centered on Elijah Brooks but on Ryan himself. "Sir," the first officer said again, his tone even, almost calm, "we are going to need to address what just occurred here." And the phrasing, careful and deliberate, carried a weight that settled deeper than any direct accusation, because it acknowledged the moment without dramatizing it, letting the truth speak for itself. Ryan swallowed, the movement small but noticeable, his composure still intact on the surface but beginning to fracture underneath, and his eyes flicked once more toward Elijah, searching, questioning, as if hoping to find something that would restore the version of reality he had been operating in. But Elijah did not offer that. He simply stood there, calm, present, his gaze steady but not confrontational, and that absence of reaction made everything feel sharper, clearer, more difficult to dismiss. "There has to be some confusion," Ryan said, his voice lower now, less certain, the confidence that once carried it replaced by something more fragile. "I was handling a security concern." And the words, though structured the same way as before, no longer held the same authority. They felt like an explanation rather than a command. The officer nodded slightly, acknowledging the statement without validating it, and he glanced briefly at the tablet once more before returning his attention to Ryan. "We understand your position," he said, "but the individual you approached is listed under protected ownership status tied to this facility." And the sentence, precise and formal, landed with quiet finality, its meaning unfolding not in volume but in clarity, because it did not argue, it confirmed. A soft murmur moved through the crowd again, subtle but growing, as the pieces began to align in the minds of those watching, the narrative shifting fully now, no longer uncertain, no longer ambiguous, and Ryan felt it, that collective understanding, pressing in from all sides, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable. "Protected ownership," Ryan repeated, almost to himself, the words unfamiliar in his own voice, and for the first time, the realization began to take shape, not complete, not fully formed, but present enough to disrupt everything that had come before it. Elijah's posture did not change, but there was a quiet shift in the way he held himself, not an elevation, not a display, just a subtle alignment with the truth that was now surfacing, as if he no longer needed to remain neutral within the moment because the moment had finally caught up to him. The officer continued, his tone steady. "This means any interaction involving removal or restriction requires verification at a higher level before action is taken." And though the words were procedural, Their implication was deeply personal in this context, because they reframed what had already happened, placing it outside the boundaries of acceptable conduct. Ryan's shoulders lowered slightly, the rigid structure of his stance loosening as the weight of the situation settled in more fully, and his gaze dropped for a brief second before returning to Elijah, this time without the same certainty, without the same assumptions, and in that brief exchange, something shifted internally, something that could not be undone. "I did not know," Ryan said quietly, the admission almost instinctive, almost reflexive, and yet it carried a weight that extended beyond the words themselves, because it acknowledged not just a lack of information, but a failure to look deeper, to question, to pause. Elijah met his gaze, and for a moment, the space between them felt different, no longer defined by hierarchy or misunderstanding, but by a quiet clarity, and when Elijah spoke, his voice remained calm, measured. "That is why I asked you to verify," he said, not as a reprimand, not as a challenge, but as a simple statement, one that did not seek to escalate but to conclude. The officer glanced between them, then nodded slightly, as if recognizing that the moment had reached its turning point, and he gestured gently for Ryan to step further aside, not as a command, but as a continuation of the process that had already begun. And as Ryan moved, slower now, more deliberate, the weight of the shift settled completely. The balance of power no longer in question, no longer hidden, but fully revealed in the quiet, undeniable space between them, where assumption had given way to truth and nothing could return to what it had been before. The moment did not end with a loud declaration or a dramatic conclusion, it dissolved slowly, almost quietly, like tension releasing from a room that had been holding its breath for too long, and as Ryan Caldwell stood slightly apart now, no longer at the center but at the edge of the situation he had set in motion, the reality of what had happened settled into him in layers, each one heavier than the last. The officers remained composed, their presence steady, guiding the process forward with calm efficiency, their voices low as they continued speaking with Ryan just out of the immediate circle, but their attention, their respect, had already shifted, subtly but unmistakably, toward Elijah Brooks. Elijah did not step forward to claim anything, did not raise his voice or demand acknowledgement, he simply adjusted the sleeve of his worn coat with a small, deliberate motion, as if returning to himself after allowing the moment to unfold exactly as it needed to, and then he looked once more across the terminal, not at the crowd, not at the officers, but out toward the wide glass windows where the late afternoon light stretched across the runway in long, quiet lines. The crowd began to loosen, slowly at first, people lowering their phones, glancing at one another with expressions that carried a mix of surprise and reflection, as if they had witnessed something more than just an incident, something that lingered beyond the immediate moment, something that would stay with them longer than they expected. A woman near the charging station shook her head slightly, not in disbelief but in recognition, while the teenage boy who had been recording lowered his phone, his posture shifting from curiosity to something quieter, more thoughtful. The overhead announcement resumed its steady rhythm, calling passengers to board, reminding everyone that the world continued moving, even when a moment like this had briefly interrupted its flow. Ryan's voice carried faintly from where he stood with the officers, lower now, measured, no longer attempting to assert control but to understand, to respond, and though his words were not fully audible, the tone alone revealed the change, the shift from certainty to accountability, from assumption to realization. Elijah turned slightly, his gaze passing over the scene one last time, and there was no expression of victory in his face, no satisfaction, only a calm acceptance, as if the outcome had never been in question. As if the moment had simply arrived where it was always meant to go. He took a step forward, then another, his footsteps quiet against the polished floor, blending into the natural rhythm of the terminal, and as he moved, the space seemed to open around him, not out of deference, but out of an unspoken recognition that something had been revealed, something that could not be unseen. The light from the windows caught briefly on his face, softening the lines of his expression, and for a moment, he paused. Just long enough to look back, not directly at Ryan, but in his direction. A glance that carried no judgment, no resentment, only a quiet finality, as if to acknowledge the moment without holding on to it. Then he continued walking, his figure moving steadily toward the far end of the terminal, where the sounds of travel resumed their normal pace, where the lines of people, the movement of bags, the rhythm of departure and arrival carried on as they always did. Behind him, the officers remained with Ryan, their conversation ongoing, the process continuing, but the center of the moment had already shifted away, following Elijah as he disappeared gradually into the flow of the crowd. And in the space he left behind, there was a silence, not empty, but full, carrying the weight of what had just happened, a quiet reminder that presence is not defined by appearance, that authority is not always visible at first glance, and that sometimes, the most powerful moments are the ones that end without a word, leaving only the echo of truth settling into the air long after everything else has moved on.